South Africa became nervous. They decided to eliminate me in 1981 by sending an agent to plant a bomb under my car. That attempt was abortive. 2 other attempts to get me killed. They were crazy.
The date is April 10th, 1993. It's about 20 minutes after 10 on a regular morning in the racially integrated suburb of Don Park in Johannesburg, South Africa. Chris Hani, who at this time is probably the most popular black politician after Nelson Mandela, pulls into his driveway with his 15-year-old daughter. An unknown assailant attacks him, delivering 2 gunshots to the head and 2 more to the chest. He stood no chance. This incident almost succeeds in starting a racial war in South Africa, effectively retarding the ongoing negotiations to end apartheid and the elections that were to come in the next year. Through the assassination of this man, the course of South African history is changed forever. It accelerates the negotiations between the ANC and the ruling apartheid government, but also limits, as it were, the horizons of a post-apartheid South Africa by eliminating the ANC's potential radical demands through someone like Chris Hani. Let's dive into the life and the works of this African revolutionary leader, and also get into who put a hit on him and who they hired to do the job. Martin Thembisile Hani was born on the 28th of June 1942 in the village of Sabalele in the Transkei, which is today the Eastern Cape province. His father, Gilbert, was a migrant worker in the Transvaal mines, while Mary, his mother, worked on a farm to supplement the family income. He was the 5th out of 6 children and one of the 3 who didn't die during infancy. The name Chris, actually, which he adopted later on in life, was his brother's name. Growing up, Hani was a devout Catholic, ultimately becoming an altar boy at the age of 8. He apparently wanted to become a priest, but his father did not agree with this and refused him permission to go to the seminary. In 1953, when Chris Hani was 11, the South African government introduced the Black Education Act, which in essence formalized the segregation of black schooling and laid the foundation for Bantu education. This was arguably the first of many incidents during his schooling years that served to politicize him. As young as he was, it made him aware of the impediments that the apartheid system imposed on his and in fact other black children's futures. Chris Hani's father, Gilbert, also appears to have exposed him to a lot of political thought from a very young age. Gilbert, you see, was an active member of the African National Congress, or the ANC, and he later left South Africa to seek asylum in Lesotho. Unsurprisingly, Chris Hani joined the ANC in 1956 following the raid and arrest of more than 100 people, including Nelson Mandela, who were charged with treason. On the education side, Hani matriculated from the Lovedale Institute before joining the University of Fort Hare in 1959. It was while at Fort Hare that Chris Hani would be exposed to Marxist ideology while he was also exploring his childhood passion of classics and literature. He left Fort Hare in 1961, and the following year he graduated from Rhodes University with a bachelor's in Latin and English. Chris then moved to the Western Cape, where he worked as an article clerk at a Cape Town law firm from 1962 to 1963. Chris Hani had an uncle who had been active in the Communist Party of South Africa. This was an organization that was formed in 1921, but it ended up dissolving itself following the Suppression of Communism Act in 1950. The former members of the party basically went underground, and they later formed the South African Communist Party in 1953. So, within the context of his growing frustration with the apartheid system, Chris Hani joined the underground South African Communist Party in 1961. In the following year, he joined Umkhonto weSizwe, or the MK, which was the military wing of the ANC. Owing to his high level of education, it didn't take long for Chris Hani to rise up the ranks of the MK. Within several months, he was part of the Western Cape's MK leadership known as the Committee of Seven. Hani's first run-in with the law came in 1962 when he was arrested at a roadblock in Cape Town. He was found in possession of anti-government literature and he was charged under the Suppression of Communism Act. While on bail, he crossed into Botswana to attend the ANC conference that was held in Lobatse, only to get arrested on his way back into South Africa and get slapped with an 18-month jail sentence. In 1963, having exhausted virtually all possible legal appeals against conviction, Chris Hani went underground, first following his father into exile in Lesotho and later leaving for the Soviet Union, where he received military training. Chris Hani returned to Africa from the Soviet Union in 1967, and he immediately took up an active role in the Zimbabwean War of Independence. He was the political commissar in ZAPU's Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army, or ZIPRA, which operated out of Zambia. As a part of the Lituli detachment, which was a combined force of ANC and ZIPRA men, Chris Hani participated in all three battles of the Wankie campaign, which were fought against the Rhodesian security forces in the Wankie Game Reserve, which is today known as the Hwange National Park. While the Wankie campaign provided both the ANC and ZIPRA with much needed publicity, it was a military disaster. Chris Hani himself was lucky to escape into Botswana, where he was unfortunately arrested for weapons possession and jailed for just about 2 years. He returned to Zambia at the end of 1968 to continue his work with ZIPRA. But his imprisonment had left him somewhat bitter and quite critical of the ANC leadership. Together with half a dozen other MK soldiers, Chris Hani had drafted a document that came to be known as the Hani Memorandum. In this document, Hani and his comrades accused the ANC leadership of being complacent and basically having lost focus on the armed struggle and seemingly not eager to discuss the failures of the Wankie campaign and to draw lessons from it. The outcome of the Hani Memorandum was the 1969 Morogoro conference, which was held in Tanzania. It was at this conference that a new strategy for defeating the apartheid system was adopted, as well as the decision to extend ANC membership to non-Africans. In 1973, Chris Hani returned to Lesotho, where he organized units of the MK for guerrilla operations in South Africa. By 1982, Hani was a big deal, so much so that he became the focus of several assassination attempts by the South African security forces, including at least one car bombing.
When we established ourselves in Lesotho and were able to set up the underground, South Africa became nervous. They decided to eliminate me in 1981 by sending an agent to plant a bomb under my car. Then they made 2 other attempts to get me killed.
He was then transferred back to Zambia, to the center of the ANC's political leadership in Lusaka, where he was elected to the ANC National Executive Committee. Hani continued to rise through the ANC ranks, ultimately becoming the MK's Chief of Staff in 1987, while also rising in senior membership in the South African Communist Party. In 1990, South African President F.W. de Klerk lifted the 30-year ban on the ANC, the South African Communist Party, and other liberation parties like the Pan-African Congress. At this point, Chris Hani returned to South Africa, and not before long, he had built up a reputation as a very charismatic and popular speaker in the townships. Naturally, Chris Hani became involved in the negotiations between the South African government and the ANC, where it was agreed that the armed conflict should be suspended to allow for peaceful talks. But being the militant revolutionary that he was, at some point, Chris Hani threatened to pull the ANC out of the negotiations and resume the armed struggle if the South African government didn't make certain concessions. Chris Hani was also closely associated with Joe Slovo, the then Secretary General of the South African Communist Party. The two of them came to be considered as fearful figures by South Africa's extreme right, like the AWB Afrikaner Resistance Movement and the Conservative Party. In 1991, Joe Slovo announced that he had cancer and he resigned from his position as the Secretary General of the SACP. Chris Hani took up the position, and in the following year, he stepped down as Chief of Staff of the MK to focus more on the SACP. There is a belief in South Africa that, as Secretary General, Chris Hani actually made progress in popularizing the Communist Party, considering that the fall of the Soviet Union had sort of discredited the ideology. He was known to be passionate, charming, and charismatic to the point of having what some people called a cult-like following. It was looking like the South African Communist Party was going to give the ANC a run for its money at the envisaged 1994 elections, until of course tragedy struck, effectively changing everything for South Africa. On the 10th of April 1993, as he got home with one of his daughters, Chris Hani was shot and killed by a Polish white supremacist by the name of Janusz Wallis. The South African police arrested Janusz within 15 minutes of the murder, and within a few hours they announced that he had been working alone. This was of course not true. Janusz Wallis was a Polish immigrant who came to South Africa in 1981 and had been an active member of the far-right Afrikaner Resistance Movement, or AWB. He was also very closely linked to Conservative MP Clive Derby-Lewis, who, as it turned out, had actually given him the gun with which to kill Chris Hani. During the course of the investigation, it was also discovered that Janusz had a hit list, which included people like Nelson Mandela and Joe Slovo. Strangely, there also emerged a theory that pointed to a conspiracy that went beyond just the South African far right. A theory that the ANC too might have been involved in the assassination of Chris Hani, owing to the differences in the ANC's and the SACP's ideologies. Another theory is that the South African government, which claimed to be a neutral investigator and pinned the blame on the far-right forces, was actually in cahoots with the far-right, and that the whole plan was hatched back in July of 1992. But whatever the case, the assassination of Chris Hani just about brought South Africa into a racial war. Nelson Mandela had to go on national television to call for peace and calm as the South African people had taken to the streets and began causing serious harm and damage.
We are a nation in mourning. Our pain and anger is real, yet we must not permit ourselves to be provoked by those who seek to deny us the very freedom Chris Hani gave his life for. Let us respond with dignity in a disciplined fashion.
Many people have said that it was Mandela's speech at this trying time that effectively made him the de facto leader of South Africa. Multiple memorial services were held in different parts of South Africa, and Chris Hani was finally laid to rest at the South Park Cemetery in Johannesburg. And even then, there was still a lot of tension as the AWB brought out heavily armed men to line up the streets with white residents along the route of the funeral procession. Chris Hani was an extraordinary leader whose life was cut short out of fear of where he would possibly lead the new democratic South Africa. He might be gone, but he will always be remembered for the active role he played in the fight against apartheid, ultimately securing the political freedom enjoyed by many South Africans today. His death came at a very critical time for South Africa, and in a way, it helped persuade the bickering negotiators of the Multi-Party Negotiating Forum to pick a date for the country's first democratic elections. The elections were held in April 1994, where the ANC scooped about 63% of the vote. The following month, Nelson Mandela was inaugurated as the first black president of South Africa. Janusz Wallis and his accomplice, Clive Derby-Lewis, had been sentenced to death just 6 months after the assassination of Chris Hani. But in a weird twist of events, the new South African government changed these sentences to life imprisonment, as the death penalty was now seen to be unconstitutional. In 1997, within the context of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Janusz and Derby-Lewis tried to apply for a pardon with the argument that they were working for the Conservative Party and so the assassination was a political act. The TRC, however, ruled that Hani was assassinated by right-wing extremists who were acting independently, and therefore the two men remained in jail. Clive Derby-Lewis was granted parole in 2015 because he had terminal lung cancer, and he died the following year. Janusz, on the other hand, had been granted early release in 2016, but the decision was overturned due to criticism by the ANC government. But in 2022, he was finally released on a 2-year parole after being stabbed by a fellow inmate. If you've enjoyed this video, be sure to like, share, and leave a comment. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing to the channel. I'm Simon Bayani, and this is Africa in Retrospect. Cheers for now.